idea of tapestry thinking sort of came from, I think, large part from my own mixed background. My dad was from India. He was raised as a Hindu. My mother was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, of Russian parentage, and she was raised as an Orthodox Jew. So from birth, I was in this family that had this like wonderfully weird mixture of religious faiths. But what was really amazing about my parents, I think, is that they were able to raise my 4 brothers and sisters and me with a sense that there doesn't have to be conflict between these two religions, but rather in their essence, at their basic level, all religions are pretty much the same. They're about respecting your elders. They're about contributing to the world. And so I think what that kind of boiled down to me in my spirit is that things that seem different, Judaism, Hinduism, on the surface, are actually not that different. Because if you can get down to the basics of what those two religions are, you find that there's common ground.
Welcome to Holy Earth, where we talk about faith and earth stewardship. I'm Lydia Theobald.
And I'm Phil Fernberg. If you have already subscribed to our show, thank you. We're so happy to have you supporting. And if you have not yet, would you please go and hit that subscribe button? Or if you'd like to leave a rating or review or a comment, all of these things help us grow and reach more listeners like you.
We have a superstar guest today, Nalini Nadkarni, a renowned research scientist, a fierce tree advocate, and a compelling communicator. We're also going to announce some exciting collaborations we have coming up with Nalini and her Our Trees initiative with National Geographic. By the way, if you watch this episode on YouTube, you can see some incredible photos of Nalini's work in the rainforests of Costa Rica. But before we get to Nalini, we're bringing on another special guest, Dr. Sam Hurt, Associate Professor of Biology at Southern Virginia University, for today's stewardship story.
Hi, Sam.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So, Sam, tell us what's happening over at Southern Virginia University.
Well, it's a beautiful day here and it's spring. And so we're starting to see blossoms come in and leaves starting to appear on the trees. And I understand you are having an episode about trees and some amazing work that's going on. We are a small campus in a small town in Buena Vista, Virginia, and been here not very long in terms of a university. We've only been around 30 years this next year. And so we're still growing and we're still finding new things to do. I came here about 10 years ago, and as I've developed as a professor of biology, I've also incorporated more and more of environmental stewardship into some of the things that I'm trying to do on campus. Last year, a few things kind of came to head at the same time. One, I started a proposal to start an environmental studies major. Also was helping some students form an environmental science club. And then I was teaching environmental science as a class. And within that class, we have a number of group projects where students are supposed to go out into the community, whether on campus or in the city or somewhere close by, and do an environmental service type project. And so these few things were gaining steam, and one of the projects, one of the groups that in this class that we're trying to do was to work with a local nonprofit in planting trees on our campus. Our campus sits on a hill. The south facing of that hill is just really just for aesthetics. There's lots of trees there. Some of these trees are really old, big oak trees and magnolias and some smaller dogwoods. But every once in a while, a big storm will come across and it'll make some of these larger old trees will fall over and that'll be the end of that tree. And we haven't really had a lot of replacement for these trees. So this was an effort to start some new tree planting on our campus. But I had to get approval from, the powers that be on campus. So to do that, I was fortunate enough to do a presentation in front of the president and the president's council, where I incorporated not only the efforts of my students and their desire to make campus more beautiful, but also tied it into the mission of the university and the gospel of Jesus Christ, and how environmental stewardship is really an imperative of being a disciple of Christ. And I not only asked for permission for some of these projects and these other things going on. And throughout that year, we have the student group that has now been formed. We have an environmental studies major this is our first year. We're starting it this year. And then we were able to get permission for those trees to get planted on campus. And so the students came up with the day, did some advertising. We were supposed to actually do it in 2 days, but we had so many volunteers and so much participation that we got 60 trees planted on our front hill in just the first day. We ran out of trees because we had so many volunteers. So it's great to see so many people get involved. The work with those trees continues. I have students in my ecology class that are measuring them and seeing their growth from year to year. I have another student I just met with last week who wants to look at the spring again now that the leaves are coming in, to see how many survived our very weird and harsh winter. It's been a great project, and it continues to not only make campus more beautiful, but have a lot of people involved in watching these trees grow. And hopefully we have most of them survive, and we'll see these flourish on our campus.
That is so cool. For listeners that aren't familiar with Southern Virginia University, will you explain the relationship with the church that the university has?
Yeah, it's pretty unique in that we aren't owned by the church. Kind of the best term is we're LDS serving. So we use the restored gospel of Jesus Christ as our model, but we aren't officially affiliated with it. Most of our students are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have, I think, the largest concentration of young Latter-day Saints on the East Coast. We have a full stake with 7 wards and an institute building, which is just right off campus. So it's a big influence on our campus, and a great collaboration and a pretty unique relationship. We don't have general authorities that are on our board or that are making the decisions for our education, our university, but it's still a big part of our mission.
It's so cool to hear how talking about the doctrine of earth stewardship was a big piece in a lot of these things happening, that was a motivating factor for all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I love to bring that in. It's important for anyone everywhere. You don't necessarily need the gospel of Jesus Christ, but adding that layer is a beautiful part of our faith.
No small thing that they were able to recognize and let you move through the bureaucracy of a university only partially scathed, and that they also saw that it was an important tenet of the faith to be put into action right there on campus. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that story, Sam.
You bet. Thank you.
And we appreciate you coming on, and we hope to hear more from the East Coast and what's happening over at SVU, and to keep track of all of the great things that you're doing over there.
Yeah, I'd love to come on anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that is a perfect segue into our guest today. We're very excited to present an episode with Nalini Nadkarni, who is a tree canopy ecologist who spent 4 decades dangling from branches to study how forests inform our daily lives. She is a global ambassador and explorer at large for the National Geographic Society, and has mostly been recognized there for her pioneering work in the study of Costa Rican rainforest canopies. Nalini is an avid science communicator who has shared her love of trees with communities as diverse and broad as religious congregations, people in prison, urban youth, and Barbie fans, which we will talk about.
This year, Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship is collaborating with Nalini for the Our Trees initiative, which we're super excited about. We're sponsoring a tree-themed writing and art contest with the winners announced at our fall forum in October. Selected entries will be posted on Nalini's Our Trees website and may be featured on Nalini's Tree Note podcast. In addition, Nalini will give a naturalist talk at our tree planting event in the Salt Lake City area on April 18th. Visit the Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship website, ldsearthstewardship.org, to sign up for our newsletter and find out more. You can also follow LDS Earth Stewardship and Holy Earth Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Links are in the show notes.
Hello, Nalini. It's so great to have you today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here with you.
We are so excited to dive into your incredible life and all the work that you've done. But I just want to start by asking kind of your stewardship journey in general. You've spent so much of your life caring for trees and studying them. So, how did that dedication develop over time?
Sure, I'm happy to share that. I think it's really true that many scientists, as well as many people of faith, that passion comes early in life. And so for me, my love of trees really started in childhood. There were these 8 maple trees that lined my parents' driveway. And I remember after school, starting in sort of second and third grade, I would come home, grab an apple, grab a book, and then climb one of those 8 maple trees. And for me, I came from a big family. There were 5 kids, chores, pets, homework, all that stuff. Trees for me, when I would climb one of those trees and sit in the sort of in the notch of one of those branches, I really felt like this is my place. My brothers and sisters weren't interested in climbing. My parents, of course, weren't interested in climbing trees. And so I guess it really became my place, and it satisfied my curiosity. I would wonder and ask questions about the squirrels that were running around. I would wonder about, like, when are the tree leaves going to fall? And so for me, it provided a source of safety, of belonging, and of curiosity. And so when I was a little kid, I made a little oath to myself when I was in third grade that when I become a grown up, I'm going to do something that helps trees and protects trees because they helped and protected me. And so, there are lots of ways that might happen. I used to imagine I might be a forest ranger or a firefighter, but I ended up deciding to pursue the biology of trees, the study of trees, trying to understand trees and their biology. And so I went to college and majored in biology. I went to graduate school and got my PhD in forest ecology. And that led really to a lifetime of research about trees. And that in turn led to understanding the importance of trees. And that led to my sense of stewardship about trees and trying to raise the awareness in all people about how amazing, how important, and how fundamental trees are to people.
I did a little homework on kind of your trajectory there, looked up your Wikipedia page, and there was something that I had to bring up, which is that there was a little time when you chose to go to Paris and be part of a dance troupe.
Yes, well, that's so interesting, Bill, that you dug that up. Because actually, I didn't quite tell all the truth because I was totally interested in trees and forest ecology, but I was also really interested in modern dance. I love dance. My mother and father gave me dance lessons ever since I was 4 years old. I did modern dance lessons and modern dance through all the way through graduate school. And so I really realized after I went to college that I had to make a choice because you can't really be a modern dancer professionally and a forest ecologist and researcher professionally. And so I realized I might have to make a choice between those two. So I ended up after college writing letters to field biology stations all over the world. I'm saying, hey, I'd like to be your field assistant just to see what it's like. What is the life of a forest ecologist like? And then I also wrote letters to dance studios all over the world just to say, I just want to get a taste of what it is to be a modern dancer. So I spent a year in Papua New Guinea in an obscure field station out in the wilds of Papua New Guinea for a year. I loved it. It was fabulous. The biologists were great. They were very sharing and open, and I was in the field all the time. And then I went to Paris, France, and I interacted with a dance studio for 6 months, and I danced and danced and danced. And then after that, I sat down in a cafe with all of my notebooks, all of my journals, and I read through them, and I had to make a decision at that point. And I realized field biology seemed to be the more promising road for me because you can work as a field biologist till you're like an old person, whereas a modern dancer, your career is over when you're 30 years old. And all the people who were biologists were really great people. They were very sharing. They were very open. They were very welcoming. Whereas the modern dancers were like, I hate to say this, but very competitive and very much like, I've got to get there first. And then you have to live in a city if you're a modern dancer. Whereas as a field biologist, you get to live in these wonderful jungly, rainforesty places. And so that went into my decision, and I started graduate school, and that's when I decided to become a full-time field biologist.
Have you done any tree choreography, any dancing?
Well, that's a great question, Lydia. There was sadness that came with giving up modern dance. But about 10 years ago, I got a phone call in my biology office from a modern dancer. Her name was Jody Lomas. And she said, Dr. Nadkarni, I really want to make a modern dance about rainforest biology. Could you help advise me? And I said, of course I could, of course. And so I
Yeah.
ended up teaching her and her whole dance troupe from San Francisco, a group called Capacitor, how to climb trees with my mountain climbing techniques. We brought them up into the forest canopy. They loved it. We did that in the Pacific Northwest. And then I brought them down to my long-term field site in Costa Rica, and we did the same thing. And they started taking off their clothes and dancing naked in the rainforest and making this amazing modern dance about rainforest biology. And we ended up performing that in San Francisco and Seattle. I didn't perform. I was the scientist who gave a little talk about rainforest diversity and fragility, but her dance troupe made this amazingly inspirational dance that encompassed the beautiful and interactive elements of the rainforest in such an expressive way, so much more expressive, so much more compelling than my scientific papers. And after the performance, we had a number of tables in the lobby where people could sign up for volunteer work to do work that would be planting trees or protecting trees and so forth. So the combination of my biology, her aesthetic dance, really contributed to this inspiration for people to sign up to carry out some kind of conservation work. So for me, it was this sort of culmination of pulling together the arts and the sciences in the service of protecting nature, which I think is something that your group is planning on doing with this upcoming conference in October, where you're having a contest of art and literature, writing essays, as well as understanding the biology of trees. And I think that's such a great idea, and it's such a great integrative approach. I really respect and admire what you're doing.
Yeah. I come from a humanities background, and I'm just such a big believer in bringing the power of the arts into real problems and real things that we care about. And I think our whole organization kind of understands how important the aesthetic aspect of our experience with nature is, and really focusing on experiencing wonder and awe. So I think the
Right.
arts are just the perfect way to make sure we're really seeing the earth and experiencing it through our senses and our spirits together.
And I would also add to that, Lydia, that we tend to separate the sciences and the arts and scientists and artists. But in fact, many scientists are also artists. I know many scientists who play the piano, who play a musical instrument, who do watercolors. And they are moved by the beauty of what they study in the lab or in the field, just as artists are. Sometimes they play down that because they think that it's not scientific or something or professional, but it's in the spirit of all of them. And I think just as a scientist can be a person of faith, I think a scientist can be a person of aesthetics, and a person of aesthetics can be interested in using the scientific approach to understand something as complex as a tree or a forest. So I think we're mistaken when we put people and groups into these different organizations when really there's much more interweaving and more overlap than what we might think.
I mean, it makes all the sense in the world to me, right? Because the sciences really came about as just new ways for us to try and understand what it means to be a human in the world.
Right.
And I can't help but feel that when you describe that experience you have with that dance troupe and choreographing about the rainforest, that you, having seen both sides of that, where dancers, I've noticed my wife is a dancer, and they are in the art of dance, you become so in tune with your body, right?
Right.
Understanding of how your body is and how it moves. And you, as a scientist, also have just a deep understanding of the body of nature. And so having those moments where you can make a program that merges those two bodies together into one
Right.
is a really profound thing.
It was profound. It really was. I think another aspect of that is I think we scientists tend to say we have all the answers. We use the scientific method. We test hypotheses. We use statistics in order to answer questions about nature. But one of the things that I learned from working with Jody, this modern dancer, I offered as we were walking through the rainforest, I said, well, surely you'll want my input on what's the difference between a vine and a liana, and who takes parental care of the frogs in the stream over there. And he said, stop, Nalini, stop. I'm perfectly capable as an artist and as a person of perceiving and understanding this complex rainforest as you are. But I use different tools. I use my body, I use my eyes, I use my senses. But I'm going to come out with communication about what is this complex forest, just as you come out with a paper or a conference proceedings or whatever. And I had to kind of step back from my all-knowing, sort of unhumble scientist mindset to say, yeah, I'll give that a try. And indeed I did, thankfully, because what I learned was that, in fact, Jody had these great insights and perceptions and ability to communicate them to groups like dancers in the audience that I could never have done. So I realized that each discipline, each way of knowing has a way of understanding and perceiving, but they are all valid. And the sooner we can learn that and be sort of intellectually humble about that, whether the concepts are science versus faith or science versus arts or science versus music, I think the more we'll all learn from each other.
Yeah. And I've noticed, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. This is a common theme in your way of inquiry in the world and talking about different ways of being and ways of knowing. And so let's go along that trajectory. So let's start with your research on trees. What is your research about?
Yeah, great question. So, when you walk into a rainforest or you walk into any forest, there are so many questions that just immediately pop out. Like, what's going on? How do these trees live so long? How are they communicating? What is going on? There's physiological questions, ecological questions, and anatomical questions. But when you are being trained to understand forests and you become a forest ecologist, you have to pick one specific aspect that you are going to become a specialist on. And so when I first started out as a graduate student in forest ecology at the University of Washington, the first semester I was there, I took a field class with the Organization for Tropical Studies, where they took 20 graduate students from around the country. They took us to Costa Rica. They took us to 4 or 5 different field stations. We learned a lot about the birds and the bees and the plants and the soils and so forth. But we had to sort of come up with a question that would become our question. And for me, when I started walking through the tropical cloud forests of Costa Rica, a place called Monteverde, I was immediately struck by the forest canopy. It's like, look at all those plants, the orchids, the bromeliads, the ferns that live up there. Look at the monkeys that are running around in the forest canopy. All of them almost completely out of sight of these biologists that were stuck on the ground. And I asked my professors, like, what's going on in the canopy? And they said, oh, well, Nalini, you can't get up there safely and non-destructively. So we just kind of assume everything that's going on up there happens down here. And so just forget it. Don't even bother studying it. But the canopy at that time in 1980 was known as the last biotic frontier. Now, if that isn't an invitation to a young scientist to study it, I don't know what is. And so I said, well, I love tree climbing. I was a kid who always climbed trees. I'm not afraid of heights. I love heights. And I love discovering the unknown. And isn't that what a scientist is supposed to do? Is to probe the unknown, to explore the frontier of what isn't yet known. And so I decided that that's what I wanted to do. And so I learned how to use mountain climbing techniques to get up into the forest canopy. And there in the cloud forest of Costa Rica, these branches and trunks were just every inch, every square centimeter was covered with plants that grow up in the canopy. Bromeliads, orchids, ferns, African violets, mosses, liverworts, just covering them. And of course, they don't have roots that go into the tree itself. They're not like mistletoes. They don't go into the vascular system of the host trees. And their roots do not go down to the ground either. So that in itself was like, holy moly, where do they make their living? Where do they get their nutrients and their water? It turns out these plants have adaptations to intercept and retain water and nutrients that are dissolved in these raindrops, these mist droplets, and take those nutrients and water in, incorporate that into their living biomass. And eventually, when they die, they slough off and fall down to the forest floor where they decompose and become available to the host trees that support them. So, in fact, what I learned over years of research was that these plants actually act like giant sponges. They're actually augmenting the nutrient cycles of the forest as a whole. And even though they themselves are small in biomass, they make up about 10% of the biomass of the forest as a whole. They play disproportionately important roles in terms of intercepting and holding on and passing on nutrients to the rest of the forest. And so that was sort of news to the scientific world. And that prompted me then to say, well, what else can I learn about epiphytes? And I began doing studies on what birds are using these epiphytic plants and their flowers for nectar and their fruits for nutrients. Many of these bromeliads, which are the shape of the top of a pineapple, they make these little pools or oases. And so birds take baths in them. And frogs lay their tadpoles and their eggs in these pools, and their tadpoles run around in them and turn into frogs. And so it turns out these epiphytic plants are important not only for nutrient cycling, but also for maintaining and allowing to flourish the birds and the wildlife that are associated with these forests. So the lesson, I think, is that although scientists had sort of overlooked this part of the forest ecosystem, it turns out when you focus on them, when you study them, when you put energy into understanding them, you find out that in fact they're really important, if not critical, for the functioning of these big rainforests. And the final part of the work that I've been working on has been what happens when these canopy plants are disturbed. And that's happening right now with climate change. We're getting longer dry spells, smaller amounts of mist and fog, which these canopy plants depend on for their water and their nutrients. And so there's a real probability that these canopy plants are going to decline and maybe even disappear. And so what does that mean in terms of the birds and the mammals that depend on them? What about the forest as a whole that uses them to augment their nutrient cycles?
Hmm. I think that that is an area I'd like to hold on a little bit. So I can tell you, I remember my first experience with epiphytes was when I went to graduate school in landscape architecture. I went to Louisiana State University. And
Okay.
in Baton Rouge, at that campus, one of the most grand things that happen when you go to visit that campus is you come into the main quad. And the main quad is under the shade of these vast old live oak trees.
Oh my gosh.
And there was 3 plants in particular that got me an understanding of what is an epiphyte, right? Air plants is like the easiest way we say it and express that. And there was 3 plants. One of them was the Spanish moss that you see
Yes.
all over the trees there. The other was resurrection fern,
Yeah.
one of the coolest plants. And then the other was tillandsia.
Yes.
I'm sure that you're really well familiar with tillandsia because that's a plant that's very common down in the forests of
Right.
Central America and South America. But the interesting thing I found about this was that Spanish moss and resurrection fern are a good illustration of the symbiosis that happens between those plants. So the coolest thing I loved about resurrection fern was that it basically is at its best when it rains and when it gets water, and then it comes out. They call it resurrection fern because then when it's a dry spell, it just goes back into dormancy. But
Exactly.
then on the other end of it, tillandsia was an invasive plant. And that plant can basically survive on next to nothing. It just sits there in the air, suspended on trees, and then it overtakes the live oaks and or the crepe myrtles, which are very common down there and all that.
Right.
And it just can overwhelm them and get rid of it. And I just had, that's always stuck with me of this thing of where these plants that have basically a very similar function
Yeah.
can do very different things to that
Right.
whole plant community. When you were talking about what does that look like? Because you were starting to talk about disruptions to these ecosystems and to these plant communities. So what's the importance of trees like these that you've been talking about in the grander ecosystem scale of both the area you're studying and in the world? And what happens when these things get disrupted?
I mean, one of the things we know about trees, and I'll speak about the tropical cloud forests of Costa Rica because I'm most familiar with that. What we know is when we remove trees, like for instance, when a farmer clears a previously intact piece of forest for a pasture for dairy cattle, which happens in Monteverde quite a bit, we lose shade, we lose the connectivity of one tree next to another. We decrease the pollinators that are able to survive when trees are close by, but not cross this sort of ocean of pasture. And so some of the specialized interactions that go on with trees in tropical regions especially is that we lose pollinators. We lose the capacity, for example, of strangler figs. Figs are like an amazing tree. They produce these literally tons of fruits that monkeys and many, many species of birds are adapted to eat. And another cool thing about figs is that they are asynchronous in their fruiting. So instead of all fruiting at once, the way many like trees do here in the temperate zone, and in the fall you get lots of peaches all at once, these fig trees sort of fruit one by one. And what does that mean? That means that these animals that are dependent on them actually have a constant availability of food within a patch of forest. So you can imagine if the pollinators for that particular species of figs gets knocked out because it can't cross that ocean of pasture, that fig tree is eventually going to be knocked out too, which means that there are going to be smaller and smaller amounts of fruit available for those animals.
Yeah, and I feel like that connects to this idea that as I was, listening to different things that different speeches you've done and things you've written, you talked a lot about this idea of tapestry thinking,
Yeah.
where kind of everything is connected and affected. So can you explain what you mean by tapestry thinking?
Sure. Well, the idea of tapestry thinking sort of came from, I think, large part from my own mixed background. My dad was from India. He was raised as a Hindu. My mother was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, of Russian parentage, and she was raised as an Orthodox Jew. So from birth, I was in this family that had this like really weird, wonderfully weird mixture of religious faiths. But what was really amazing about my parents, I think, is that they were able to raise my four brothers and sisters and me with a sense that there doesn't have to be conflict between these two religions, but rather in their essence, at their basic level, all religions are pretty much the same. They're about respecting your elders. They're about contributing to the world. They're about celebrating some sort of holiday. The holidays might differ, but the idea that you celebrate together with the people in your tribe and you have days of rejoicing. And so I think what that kind of boiled down to me in my spirit is that things that seem different, Judaism, Hinduism, on the surface are actually not that different. Because if you can get down to the basics of what those two religions are, you find that there's common ground. You find that there's similarities. You find that there are values that are held in common. And we get fooled when we think that these religions are so different, or these professions are so different, or these ways of recreating are so different, or these, whatever it is, we get fooled by only looking at the surface. And so tapestry thinking is really about bringing together threads from different entities. It might be threads of science and the arts, as we talked about, and providing a loom of some kind so that you can thread the art threads coming in on the horizontal part of that loom with the vertical threads of science. And what you end up doing then is creating a new image, an image that you would not have seen if all you had was a pile of different colored threads. You see an image of beauty or of usefulness. You see a strong fabric, a fabric that's stronger than just threads coming in from one side or the other. And so one of the things I've tried to do is to say, well, if we're going to try to protect nature, especially trees, why don't we not just use the threads of science? Why don't we weave in the threads of religion? Weave in the threads of the arts, weave in the threads of business people, weave in the threads of recreators, because all of those entities value trees in one way or another. They might have different reasons to value trees. A logger, for example, might value trees because he makes a living that way, and every tree he cuts down means money in his pocket because that's his paycheck. An artist like Jody might value trees and forests because there's so much aesthetic beauty there. A scientist like me might value trees because I'm really interested in the ecological interactions between one species as another. But we can all weave our threads together on some kind of loom that lets us augment, supplant, enhance and strengthen that tapestry of care and protection for trees. And so a lot of my career, I've been finding looms and finding threads and inviting them into this tapestry of care and protection for trees, and trying to do so with humility and trying to do so with a sense of invitation, a sense of welcoming. And I think in all the work that I've done, I've never encountered a group that said, well, I don't belong in your tapestry, because everybody does. And that's what's so amazing. I've worked with faith-based groups for a long time. I've been reading the holy scriptures of different world religions and finding references to trees and forests, making a sermon about trees and spirituality and delivering those in places of worship. I've made pamphlets where I've mapped trees in churchyards and provided information about the species of trees that live in churchyards. I've done tree plantings with tree groups. But, it really wasn't until I encountered LDS Earth Stewardship, interestingly, at a tabling event for a watershed symposium. And there was Mike Maxwell and one of his colleagues who were inviting others into their tapestry, you see. And I felt like I could go up to Mike and to Lucy and say, I have an idea of trying to bring together the LDS faith with tree protection, and I don't know how to do it. And he said, well, here you are, and here I am. and what can we do together? And so that's how I ended up being on this amazing podcast is that Mike invited me into his tapestry in order to strengthen what we all believe in, which is how can we be better stewards of the earth? And I almost cry when I think how beautiful that impetus is, because it's overcoming what might have been my prejudice about the LDS faith, because I'm not an LDS person, what his prejudice might have been because he's not a scientist. But it turns out that, as I said, these superficial things actually don't matter when what you're really about is about something as important, something as basic, something as compelling as taking care of our earth.
Yeah, I just love everything that you just said. I just think there's so much truth in there is a reason for everyone on earth to care about trees. The reason's already there. We had Catherine Hayhoe on the podcast previously.
Yes,
And
fantastic.
yeah, she stressed this idea that like everyone already has the values that they need to care about. Climate change is what she was talking about
Right.
specifically. But I think it's true for just generally caring about the earth and trees specifically. And you've just done such beautiful, important work helping people see those things. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the Barbies. I just think that's a really fun example. I was talking to my roommates about you and I was like, look, she has her own Barbie.
I do. And it's so funny. And it's so ironic too, because, a lot of people like myself, really hate Barbie, the traditional Barbie,
Yeah.
because she's so consumeristic. She's all about this floofy going to the prom, listening to Ken and everything else. And so, I thought, oh no, like when my own daughter, Ricky, was 6 years old and she said, Mom, could I get a Barbie? I thought, oh no, where have I gone wrong? But also, I was thinking at the same time and discussing this with my students was this idea of how do we bring into this tapestry of care for the earth and for trees, how do we bring in little girls, especially little girls who live in urban centers? Like for me, it wasn't hard when I was a kid growing up because I'd come home from school and there were these 8 maple trees and I could climb them. But a little kid growing up in, Nairobi or Tokyo or New York City, they don't have a tree that they can just climb up and find their own little world. And so I had to think about what is it that little girls value? What is that little girls want to be? And the obvious answer, I hate to say, was Barbie. And so this was back in 2004. So my students and I said, hey, yeah, let's make a Treetop Barbie. So I called Mattel and I said, hey, I've got a great idea for you. How about if you make a Treetop Barbie and we'll provide you information? We'll make a little pamphlet for you about canopy plants that you can send along with Barbie. We don't want any money. It's just a great idea. You'll probably get customers that you never would have gotten otherwise. And they said, no, thank you very much, Dr. Nadkarni. We make our own Barbies, yes, and we adhere to our own brand. So the students and I decided to make our own Treetop Barbies. So we went to Deseret Industries and Goodwills and we bought used Barbies. We took their clothes off. We got volunteer seamstresses to sew field clothes that looked like the field clothes that I wear. We got little helmets on eBay, and we made a little pamphlet about canopy plants for Barbie. And I put them up for sale on my academic website. Like, who reads my academic website? Very few people. So, in 20 years, we sold about like 300 of them. So, but it was okay. We thought we were doing something. But then in 2022, I got a phone call from National Geographic and they said, Nalini, we have partnered with Mattel to make a line of Explorer Barbies, and we would like you to be an advisor for us on that. Entomologist Barbie, nature photographer Barbie, a polar astrophysicist Barbie, and for as a thank you for my idea and for my advising, they made a one of a kind Nalini lookalike Treetop Barbie, which I have here in my lab, which is really funny. But for me, it was a real revelation in humility. It was saying I should stop judging why little girls love Barbie. And instead, I should say, little girls love Barbie. And if I can piggyback the message that if you want to climb trees and be a scientist when you grow up, you can do that. You don't have to. You can be a mom, you can be a business person. But if you would like to climb trees like I did, and I do, then there's a way that you can do that. And so I think it's an important message to me to understand that you have to accept what other people's values are. And if you want to move forward with promoting your own values, some people might judge me negatively for jumping on the Mattel Barbie band and saying, that's terrible. You're using this horrible exploitive, symbol of consumerism. And then that's a perfectly valid kind of conclusion to come to. But for me, I felt after thinking about it and balancing the pros and cons, I felt that it was an okay use of that vector to hop treetop climbing and science to impress little girls with the potential for their joining the teams of women who are climbing trees or doing exploration or trying to understand the world.
I love it. I think I'm naturally a little anti-Barbie myself, and I still felt like so thrilled when I saw that part of your story. So I totally get the nuance there.
Right.
Humility is a theme of your work. I feel like it's an ongoing mission of yours,
Yeah.
intellectual, spiritual, social humility. And I get the sense when I've read up on your experience that you had a similar kind of entry into exploring religious traditions and spiritual stories about trees. And maybe you weren't as immediately repulsed by religion or faith-based organizations and their views of trees or what their scriptures say, but tell us a little bit more about that. How did you start looking at that intersection?
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, I had a mixed religious background myself. I don't really self-identify as a religious person. I feel like I have spiritual proclivities, but I don't adhere to any single faith. I'm curious. I have a lot of curiosity about religion and the power that it has with people. And when I was sort of thinking about how do I get more people involved with tree conservation, I learned this fact that over 85% of people on our earth self-identify as being religious or believing in God. And I went like, what? 85%? That is a heck of a lot of bigger percentage than people who self-identify as environmentalists and conservationists. I knew that there are a lot of conflicts between science and religion. I mean, all these ridiculous debates about evolution versus creationism, they never end up with a connection. They only end up with more and more conflict because people are so rooted in what they believe in and they feel they're so right. So I knew I had to come up with some way that I could connect with religious groups or people who are religious that wouldn't make a conflict, but that would be like tapestry thinking. And so I realized that if a scientist goes into a group of religious people and starts propounding science, I'll tell you about climate change because here are the data, or I'll tell you about population, overpopulation, because here are the data, that does not necessarily fit with every religious group. And so I decided to flip things. And instead of using scientific authorities like scientific journals and scientific papers and experiments, I decided to use as my authorities for this project as religious authorities, which are exemplified and codified in religious scriptures. So I began reading the Old Testament and looking for references to the words tree and forest to get a sense of what does the Bible say about trees and forests. Well, I began reading it, and then pretty soon I thought, wow, this is going to take a long time. And so I downloaded it from the web, and I just did a search for the words tree and forest. And sure enough, I found 328 references to the words tree or forest. And then I started categorizing them into how are trees used? What are their functions? They might be an analogy to God. They might be practical use like food and shelter. They might be geographical locators like the trees of Mamre. They might be analogies to God like the apple of Solomon. They might be references to tree biology. And so I found all these references to trees and they were all positive. They were all positive. There was not a negative reference to trees in the Bible. Noah finding the olive branch signifying that he was close to land, for example. And then I began doing sort of research on the different holidays and rituals and celebrations of world religions that involve trees. Like the Jews have this wonderful holiday called Tu Shabbat, which celebrates the new year for the trees. And they have a special Seder or ceremonial meal where they eat the nuts and fruits of different trees. Buddha found enlightenment underneath the fig tree. How significant is that? And so I started pulling together all of these data because they were data. They came from religious sources, but they were information. And I put together a sermon that I called Trees and Spirituality. And then I began knocking on the doors of churches and synagogues and temples and saying, hey, I'm a scientist, but I've done research and I would love to tell your congregation about trees and spirituality. Well, the Unitarians invited me in first. They're quite liberal. And so I got to give a sermon, and I didn't try to discourage any Unitarians in the congregation from believing in God. They saw that. In fact, I was bringing them information about their own Holy Scriptures. And so I began getting passed around from one church to another, one faith to another, just really having a wonderful time sort of weaving together what I had learned from these congregations, from these Holy Scriptures, about trees and forests. And that then led to other activities like mapping trees in churchyards. I figured, well, you think of a church and you think inside the church it's holy. But then I thought, wait a minute, the church is in a churchyard. And the churchyard has trees and soil in it, usually. And so if the church is sacred, so is the soil in the churchyard, and so are the trees that grow in the soil. So wouldn't they be sacred too? And so I started mapping them, and we made these little booklets with information, scriptural information, and scientific information about each of the species that grow in those churchyards. And then that led to tree plantings, that led to talks in seminaries, giving talks to clergy in training, which I thought was important because that has then sort of a multiplicative effect. And then that led to some really amazing conversations with church leaders like the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he wanted to learn about ecological justice. And so I had this wonderful conversation with him. He's the leader of 380 million Anglicans and Episcopalians, about ecological justice and why that's important for him as a religious leader to know about that. So all of those experiences really have led me to understand that congregations, for the most part, at least the ones I encountered, are open to people outside their religion as long as you are approaching them in a respectful and humble way. I also had to learn humility. I mean, talk about humility, Phil. I remember a man from a Baptist church came up to me and he said, Dr. Nadkarni, can you give me your email? And I said, no, he's going to proselytize me. That's what he wants my email for. And I said, I'm a Hindu Jew. I am not going to become a Baptist, so you might as well forget it. He said, no. We have organized a tree planting, and we thought maybe you and your students would like to join us. Boom! Boom! I was so close-minded to assume that he was going to proselytize me about his religion. I myself have never organized a tree planting, and he was inviting me to one that he's already organized. And so that was such a signal to me that you can't presume anything when you walk into some other world, especially some other religious world, because if your expectation is, oh, they're going to proselytize you, and what an embarrassing moment that was, to think that, to make this presumption on his part and instead to humbly receive this invitation from him was really a learningful experience for me.
Cool. It's so beautiful. And I think sometimes we go too far with one or the other, where we say, I want to be humble, so I'm just going to do my own thing and I'm not going to worry what other people are doing. But if it's really a true good thing, then we want to share. We want to share good fruit with our fellow man,
That's right.
I think that's so beautiful. And I also love the time that you have spent in other people's traditions and texts. And I was able to read part of your paper that you wrote about things in the Book of Mormon. I was humbled to hear that you had spent time in some of our religious texts. In college, I was a research assistant for George Handley, and one of the things I was working on was going through all of our religious texts and pulling out anything about the earth, the environment. And there is so much. And that is one of our core beliefs at Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship, that an environmental ethic is a natural fruit of our doctrine, that you don't have to stretch anything. You don't have to even really go looking. It's right there on the surface.
Right.
So I just think it's amazing, all of the humble and courageous work.
The article that you mentioned, I think maybe some of your listeners might be interested in reading. I have a wonderful colleague named David Belknap. He's the electromicroscopist in our biology department here at the University of Utah, and he's also a very devoted and avid LDS member. In fact, his dad was the organist for the Tabernacle Choir in Temple Square, and he and I have spent a lot of time together. He's always answered like the many questions I have about the LDS faith. And he approached me several years ago saying, Nalini, we should write a paper together about trees and the LDS faith. And it took a long time because there is so much there, as you said, but also he was very, very careful, very, I would almost say persnickety about getting every reference exactly right. And so we wrote a paper for The Interpreter, which is an LDS publication called Trees and the Love of God. And it was really about, the central idea was that one story of Lehi and his dream of this tree with white fruits and what that means. But he also brought in so many different references from the Book of Mormon and the Bible. And really, his conclusion was that trees are exemplary examples of how people of the LDS faith should be living, that they should be strong, that they should be flexible, that they should be giving and contributing, that they can be long-lived, and that, and it was just sort of like example after example of how trees provide a model for those who want to live in a righteous way. I thought it was really beautiful. And I felt too, as I read through the paper, that this is true not just of people of the LDS faith. Trees are a model for everybody.
Yeah, we'll link that paper in the show notes. So,
Oh, that's great.
and yeah, I have forever and ever, I have loved the symbol of the tree in our scripture. I have my Tree of Life necklace
Oh,
on,
that's so great.
and I don't know if you can see, in between my two plants, there's a little tree right there
I do.
that I got when I was a missionary in Argentina, because the Tree of Life is a
Wow.
big symbol for them. And for me, it, like you were saying, it represents all the good qualities that we see in God and in our Savior Jesus Christ. And like it says in the Tree of Life vision, it is the love of God, which is Jesus Christ, which is everything good, so everything that we need to strive to be. But yeah, we'd love to hear your comments on a few of those different trees that we have in our scriptures. So can you comment on first the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life from the Garden of Eden? And then if there's any other comments you want to add about the tree of life from Lehi's dream. And then we'd also love to talk about the sacred grove and Joseph Smith.
One of the things that struck me about the trees in the Garden of Eden and the tree from Lehi's dream was that, first of all, both of them express such positive aspects, that, the tree of life, what's more important than life, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil is also such an important part of, and I can say this as an academic, knowing knowledge is important, whether it's knowledge of the evil things in the world or the good things in the world. I think we need to know those. And so the message I take from that is that I'm grateful that that tree is such a central symbol, because it emphasizes the importance of knowledge of whatever kind. Another thing that struck me about Lehi's tree, again, with the white fruits that are, sweeter than any other fruit and juicy and delicious, and that's the love of God for his followers. Neither of those trees do you ever learn what species it is. People ask me like, "Hey, Nalini, what species is this tree? What species is that tree in the Bible?" And we don't know. We don't know. And I think that might be significant, because what it means is it's generalizable. It's not just a fig tree, or it's not just an oak tree. And there's room for specificity of saying this is an oak tree and this is a fig tree. But I was struck by the fact that if you don't know what the species is, it could be any tree, right? It could be any tree that you look at. It could be a crummy little street tree on State Street. It could be the most magnificent redwood in California. Actually, it doesn't matter, because what matters is the message that is being portrayed or conveyed in the story of the tree of life, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or Lehi's tree. And so it means you can find that wisdom, or that modeling that we talked about, having trees as a model for your life. You can find that anywhere. And one of the things that I often encounter when I give my National Geographic talks about trees to big audiences all over the country is people say, "Well, what's the tallest tree? What's the oldest tree? And what's the fattest tree? And what's the biggest tree?" And I always want to respond. And I do. I say, I really don't care. I really don't care what the biggest tree is. I don't care what the oldest tree is. What I care about is trees. And sometimes a little gnarled tree that you see in the middle of a city park that's had dogs peeing on it for years, and, it doesn't have much water, and people forgotten to fertilize it. Those trees actually, in me, evoke a greater sense of respect than the tallest redwood in California, or the most cared for oak tree in some big park, because they withstood, the slings and arrows of outrageous time. And all of those things that trees can do, just like people. You see an incredible athlete in the Winter Olympics. You go like, oh, they went down the hill in 2 seconds flat. But then if you walk along the street and there's this little old lady, with a walker who's just barely making it down the street. She takes about 10 minutes to go a whole block. Actually, I think she's worthy of our respect as much as that skier is in the Winter Olympics, because she has also suffered the slings of outrageous fortune and is persisting and living on. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that I really appreciate these very important symbolic trees in the Bible and the Book of Mormon. And I love the fact that they weren't identified as a particular tree, because it means we can expand out from to any tree that we encounter.
That reminds me a little bit of the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Have you ever read that book?
Yes, that's right. I read that as a little girl. And my mom was from Brooklyn, so I always loved it.
Yeah, I assume you must have thought of that just with ties to Brooklyn. That tree is an ailanthus tree. It's a tree of heaven, which is an immensely noxious and invasive tree in the all around the U.S. And I've had to battle with it myself in my own yard before, and it was a battle. But it was such a good example of this greater metaphor of how that person and the experience of her family can be related to that tree that is basically growing between the cracks of a sidewalk on the side of a building in Brooklyn.
Exactly.
I'd never thought of it that way before, in that if you have these metaphorical trees put into a specific species, they might not be able to have the universality that you could hope for.
Right.
If you're zoomed out and you're thinking about the universal things that are about trees, they have roots, they have structure.
Right.
They have leaves. These things can be, the way that we put it in the Book of Mormon, is they can be likened to your life, right? You can liken the scriptures to your life and to the way that you want to be and the way that you feel you should be moving in the world. I really, really love that.
Yeah. And I'll also say, people say, oh, Nalini, you're so fixated on trees. And I say, yeah, I am. But, I do think of trees as just part of the bigger world of nature. And there are other elements of nature that are, of course, equally important, equally fascinating, equally significant. Every species, every individual out there, including particles of soil and microorganisms and molecules of air, they're all part of nature. And I happen to be enamored and connected to trees and their structures and their physiology and so forth. But everything I say about trees and how we should be paying attention to them could also be said of octopi and soil particles, um, giraffes, and every other element of nature. I think trees lend themselves well to people loving them because they are so compelling. Their structure, dendritic structure, the way that they have this structure of a nerve or our circulatory system or our nervous system, that makes us, I think, have a kinship towards trees. River systems are like trees. So we see trees everywhere around us when you think about it. And so that's a sense of familiarity, I think, that we have with trees. I feel like that trees are easy to get people to say, yeah, let's go with trees. But it doesn't mean that they're the only element that I think about when I think about nature. It's just one of many. So I see them as sort of ambassadors to nature. They're like the, what do you call it? The entry drug to nature.
Yeah. Nalini, you've done such a great job of helping us understand not only how important trees are scientifically, but how meaningful they are in our lives personally. We talked earlier that I wanted to delve into this a little bit with you, is there are so many different ways of knowing in the world, and we've talked about that: scientific, spiritual ways, indigenous ways of knowing, traditional ecological knowledge. And in a day like today, whether it's politics, whether it's social dynamics, whether it's political, or conflict in the world, whether it's science and religion, it often seems that these things are being unfairly pitted against each other. How have you been able to bridge that gap and in your work?
Boy, I'd have to think about that one. Obviously, there are conflicts with how we use trees or how we treat trees or how we manage trees, because clearly, when you think about conservation and when you say, oh, we want to make a park, and protect these trees from being cut down. I've seen many cases of that, especially during the 1980s, when the loggers and the mill owners in the Pacific Northwest were saying, whoa, we're running out of old growth forests. We need to keep cutting it down. And conservationists were saying, like, there's so little land left in old growth forests. We need to preserve it. And the northern spotted owl, for example, is an example of a bird that requires that. And so we're going to use that as and put it on the endangered species list in order to protect these lands. Unbelievable conflict. I mean, scientists were being hung in effigy down the streets of Forks, Washington. And there really seemed to be like no answer to that, because they wanted the resource of old growth forest for lumber and timber and a living, and conservationists wanted this old growth forest for preservation of unique species that would go extinct otherwise. And as time went on, there were a lot of legal struggles and legislative struggles and policy struggles. Right now, when you go to the Pacific Northwest and you go to northwestern Washington, you see a lot of ecotourism. There are 250,000 people who visit Olympic National Park. So in terms of the economy now, it's not lumber anymore. That disappeared. I mean, that wasn't only because of these conservation. It's because of increasingly automated lumber mills and so forth. And so there's been a shift, there's been a transformation of that whole economy to move towards ecotourism, which fosters nature, which trains young people to become natural history guides, rather than sending this wood, this precious wood that was going to run out at some point anyway, into lumber mills. And so now there aren't even lumber mills that can take this large scale, large diameter logs anymore because of this overall transformation that has occurred. And it took time, and it took pain, and it took a lot of resentment and a lot of really, really difficult interactions to get to this point where we've come to a new place, a new entity, which is the Pacific Northwest in 2026. I myself have really not been in any situation where I've approached a church or, a field station or a corporation or some other, or a prison even, or because, I've worked in prisons also, working with nature and with inmates growing trees for restoration. Talk about a hardened, to be sort of frank about it, a hardened institution. Our system of mass incarceration is one of the least flexible entities there is. But when I went into prisons and I said, I think that connection with nature is going to help calm the men and women who are working with nature. I think that there's an opportunity for education, which we have data brings down recidivism and increases post-release employment. That was enough to sort of get them going. And we've had a very vibrant conservation prison interaction in Washington state and in Utah and other states also for a very long time. So, as I said, it often takes time. Like my connecting with your church, I've been working with faith-based groups for over 20 years now, and it's only since 6 months ago that I was able to sort of make this entry into your church, your particular type of church. But part of it was that I have been working with faith-based groups, and so I know a little bit about how to work with them. It gave me a little bit of credibility when I started talking to Mike Maxwell, that I wasn't just some weirdo scientist coming in and wanting to stomp down your church walls, that he came to understand that, in fact, I was sincerely trying to do this in a mutualistic, synergistic way. So I don't think it's time wasted. I think it's just sometimes you need to know that it takes time to make partnerships and to weave together those threads in productive and synergistic ways.
Yeah. Wow. So many incredible insights today. This has just been such an enlightening conversation, and we're so grateful. Do you have any other thoughts you want to share as we wrap up?
Just one thing I'd like to share is in conjunction with the National Geographic Society. I'm an explorer at large there. Last year, I started an initiative called the Our Trees Initiative. And it's a storytelling-based initiative to gather stories from diverse sources, from science, from the arts, from indigenous groups, from the humanities, and people's personal stories, as well as faith-based groups, to curate those in a way that we can produce educational materials and suggest actions that are appropriate for different groups. And one of those groups is faith-based groups. So we would love to share with you our website where you can post your own tree story that might have to do with LDS, happenings or not. You can post a video. You can post a photograph of your favorite tree. If you just Google our-trees.edu, you'll find our group.
We'll link that in the show notes as well. We're really excited to get as many people participating in that as possible.
Fantastic.
Phil and I are going to try to participate as well. So
Good.
Yeah.
I expect you will.
We will definitely be a part of that. And there will be, as part of our Greater Our Trees initiative, as one of the nodes in your National Geographic Our Trees initiative, Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship will have tree planting activities throughout the year around the globe. And one locally that we're going to be really excited to hopefully have you participate in with us as a Give a Naturalist talk on trees will be a planting in the local area of Salt Lake City and probably a couple of other spots in the Greater Wasatch Front. So we are very much looking forward to being full participants of the Our Trees initiative
Great.
as one of
I
our
love
own.
it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nalini, we really, really love what you do. I think it's probably safe to say that we just want to be you when we grow up. That just sounds like an amazing,
Oh, my kids then.
it's an amazing experience that you've had, and you brought so many different things for us to think about to this episode. We have our 3 signature questions we like to ask every guest. And the first one is, what is something you think our listeners can start doing today to honor and help heal the earth?
I think, first of all, to be aware of trees at all times, not just wait till you're going on some big backpacking trip, but in terms of your city life or the tree in your backyard. Because I think that the raising of awareness is really the first step in initiating actions. And I know that trees are pretty easy to overlook. They're silent, they're sedentary, they look old. But you think of a grandmother sitting on a park bench who seems to be inactive and quiet, but she's had a lot of experiences and she's a really interesting person. So I think if you can just take a moment of time as you walk home today or when you go into your backyard and just kind of look at a tree and appreciate what it lives through, how it lives, what it's doing for others. And then I think associating that with what you might have in your mind as connections to your faith, like that tree of Lehi or the tree of life or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or that the seed that turned into a tree described by Alma. I think that is a really important connection that you can make as you look at this one little tree.
I love that. Mary Oliver said, attention is the beginning of devotion. And I think about that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Our second question is, where was the last place you felt a profound sense of awe and wonder?
Wow. Let's see. Well, I just spent 6 weeks in Costa Rica at my study site, so there was plenty of awe and wonder there. But I'll tell you, I was walking to school today, to work today at the University of Utah, and I passed this stump of a redwood tree. And I have been watching this redwood tree for a long time. And the last 2 years, it has been sort of declining because of lack of water. We've had this 25-year mega drought. And I kept thinking, it's going to make it. It's going to make it. But unfortunately, last year, it did not make it. And so the grounds people had to cut it down. But nonetheless, just passing that stump made me remember the majesty of its form and its abundant, really dense leaf growth, if you know what a redwood leaf foliage looks like. And it's like perfectly conical shape. And it was almost like the tree was still there for me. And it brought me a sense of wonder just to kind of bring that back.
The next question is, how has your commitment to earth stewardship deepened your spirituality?
Well, I think it has deepened my spirituality. I think my connection, before I started thinking about connection to faith-based groups and stuff, was pretty strong. But I think that as I've become more aware of the multiple connections, the multiple threads that cross and bind, when I've looked at religious texts and my scientific knowledge has reinforced that. It's made me realize that, in fact, there are many threads from faith-based sources that have sort of augmented my own single-threaded way of looking at the world. And so that's, I guess, what I think is that faith-based folks are people who think about earth stewardship and do things with earth stewardship. And I didn't know that before I really started interacting with them, because I was of the old thinking, which is science and ecology and conservation are here and faith-based groups are here. But actually, I've come to understand that we can all meet within this loom of the tapestry of care and protection for trees.
So beautiful. Okay, I have one more fun one for you that we've never asked anyone this question. If you were a tree, what tree would you be?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Which one do you feel like is most Nalini? And this probably is harder for you than anyone else because you know all the trees.
I do. Well, I might have to like blank out of that one and say maybe I want to be like the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and not be any particular tree, which allows me to be all trees.
Trees. That is a tricky answer, but very good.
Well, okay. The universal species. I was going to say that's a cop out, but that's actually
It
pretty
was a
kind of a profound. That's kind of a profound idea.
Yeah,
Strangler fig sounds pretty sweet, though.
pretty cool.
It's a pretty good.
Yeah, it's a good tree. What are your live oaks in Louisiana? Those are
Yeah,
great too.
very majestic. Well, Nalini Nadkarni, it has been a pleasure to have you on the
Thank
podcast.
you
Thank you
so
for coming.
much. Great questions, great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a hoot. She is so delightful.
That was wonderful. I'm going to be thinking about that for a lot. So there was so much information, joy, and like different tendrils of thought that came out of that conversation for me. So I'm going to be sitting with that.
Yeah, and I gotta go climb a tree ASAP.
That's right. Yeah, I know. I want her to teach me how to climb, do a mountaineering climb up a tree and go up in that canopy. I've always thought it's so cool. Like when I see arborists do that, and
Uh-huh.
it's such a cool thing. It just looks cool. There's a nice aesthetic to it.
It really does. Yeah, after our tree planting, then we need to do a tree climbing event
That's right.
with Nalini leading the charge.
On the docket. Okay, well, it's time for listener feedback. We are very excited to hear from our audience, as always. And today we're going to bring on Marcia to talk about the most recent feedback we've received. Hey, Marcia.
Hey, it's great to be here. Good to see you.
Likewise.
Come on.
All right, today we have a comment from one of our Facebook reels about the little water cups we use during our church's sacrament service. Jenica Sedgwick, the sustainability manager for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, told us that the church is now using 100% recycled plastic cups for the sacrament meeting, and this decision was made after analyzing whether paper or plastic cups would be better for the environment. This reel got a lot of engagement. A lot of you are very interested in the paper versus plastic debate. And one of the comments that we got was from our listener, Terry Stratton. She said, yes, our ward uses plastic sacrament cups, and I have been picking them up and recycling them in my own recycling bin for the last 1.5 years now. It didn't take much to teach the teachers to put the cups in a blue recycling bin rather than in the garbage can. And in case people don't realize, the teachers are young men in the ward who prepare the sacrament. But I appreciate this comment so much. Thank you, Terry, because I love sharing stories of practical and simple ways that we can care for the earth.
It's amazed me to see how many church buildings, and it's not out of any, direct malice towards recycling or anything like that, but there's just a lot of buildings that don't do it. Like they don't have a little recycling bin in the sacrament preparation area or something like that. But it's such a simple thing, right? Like just being able to redirect that and put it into the right bin. And sometimes it just takes someone like Terry to come in and say, hey, I'll take that myself until maybe we can put people in the right bin, and then being able to educate the teachers and at a formative age to reduce, reuse, recycle, and just realize that those tiny little redirects make a big difference.
Yeah, it's really fun to imagine if all those teachers grow up and go to different wards and they each say like, oh, in my home ward growing up, we recycled these. And if they all kind of start that in their own wards when they grow up, like that kind of thing really can spread. So that's super cool. Thank you, Terry, for the comment. And thank you for all the good that you're doing in your community. And thank you, Marcia, for coming on.
Thanks, Marcia.
We would love to hear from you and create a community where we can support each other as Earth stewards. Please reach out to us by commenting on YouTube or by emailing hello@holyearthpodcast.com. If this content resonates with you or you find it useful, please subscribe to our feed on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok at Holy Earth Podcast. If you would like to get involved with Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship, visit our website at ldsearthstewardship.org and sign up for our newsletter.
Holy Earth is brought to you by Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to honor God by learning and living Latter-day Saint principles of creation care, and with the support of a generous donation from the Nature Conservancy. Our executive producer is Mike Maxwell, and our producer is Marcia Maxwell. Our theme music was composed and performed by Lydia Theobald. Our logo and graphic design are by Annie Peterson, and our social media coordinator is Chloe Mills.